In this video I'm going to talk about the Transcendental argument for the existence of God, and why this argument is fallacious due to an erroneous equivocation. There are many ways to argue against the TAG argument, but exposing this underlying fallacy demonstrates how the end conclusion that an absolute mind, namely God, exists, simply does not follow. An example of a TAG proponent committing this fallacy can be seen in the following clip.
What are laws of logic anyway? Ever thought about that? A little bit abstract, isn't it? Can you touch a law of logic? Can you accidentally swallow one? No, because they're immaterial. They're not made up of atoms. They don't have a location in space. You can't pull a law of logic out of the refrigerator. They are universal, meaning they apply everywhere. It's not like laws of logic apply in the United States, but not in Europe. There, anything goes. Okay, here you can contradict yourself. No, they're universal. They apply everywhere. They are invariant, meaning they don't change with time. Laws of logic, it's not like they apply on Monday but not on Fridays. They apply all the time. They're invariant and they're abstract because they deal with concepts. So laws of logic are immaterial, universal, invariant, abstract entities which govern all possible conceptual relationships. They describe how concepts relate to each other. And if you think about it, laws of logic are contingent upon the biblical God. The biblical God can account for all of these properties. God's thoughts would necessarily be immaterial. God is an immaterial being. He's spirit. God's thoughts would be universal because God is omnipresent. His thoughts uphold the entire universe, and therefore contradictions can't happen anywhere, for example. God's thinking would be invariant because God himself does not change with time, and therefore his thoughts do not either. And they would be abstract because all thoughts are abstract. All thoughts are conceptual. So you see, the biblical God can make sense of the fact that we have laws of logic, one correct standard of reasoning that all human beings must adhere to if we're going to be rational, if we're going to come to the truth. But other worldviews cannot account for laws of logic. Take naturalism, for example. And I mentioned earlier, many evolutionists are naturalists. They believe that nature is all that there is. The naturalist attempts to use logic and reason to support his position, but there's a problem. Logic is not part of nature, right? You can't point your telescope somewhere and see a law of logic. They're not natural. And they're immaterial. So if everything that exists is part of nature, is material, then you can't have laws of logic. And so the naturalist is trying to use something that cannot exist within his own position to support his own position and to argue against Christianity. The fact that he's able to make an argument at all proves that he's wrong.
The fundamental issue with the TAG argument is that its proponents erroneously fail to make a distinction between the laws of logic and what these laws refer to. Just like a photo of a car is not itself a car. Or more similar, like a description of a human being is itself not a human being. A description of X is not equal to X itself. The actual laws of logic are not what is universal, non-contingent and invariant. The laws of logic are simply descriptions of certain necessary truths, but these descriptions are not equal to what they describe, nor are these descriptions themselves non-contingent. Let's take the law of identity. A is A, something is what it is not what it is not. What you see here is nothing more than a human description in the English language, expressed on a computer screen, of a necessary truth. The actual truth the sentence represents is what is necessary and universal. The sentence itself, the actual law, is not. Now this may seem like a trivial point and an obvious point as well. However, the reason the TAG proponent can go from laws of logic to an absolute mind is exactly because of this erroneous equivocation. The TAG proponent argues that laws of logic are conceptual by nature, they are thought, they are mental constructs, and since necessary, universal and absolute mental constructs exist, there must be a necessary, universal and absolute mind which accounts for their existence. But what is conceptual, what is thought and mental, are the descriptions, the actual laws themselves, not that which these descriptions refer to. So what do these laws describe? What is it that they refer to? The laws of logic refer to the consistency of existence. In other words, the facts regarding existing and possible entities and the behavior of and relationships between those entities. So the law of identity is a description of the fact of identity, a description of the fact that an entity is itself. Now let's imagine a world in which nothing but a circle exists. There are no other entities apart from this circle. Since there are no minds in this world, the law of identity cannot exist, since there is nothing to think about any sort of description. But the fact of identity is still true. The circle is a circle. There is just simply nothing that can recognize this fact and describe it as such. However, if a mind would exist as well, then it is possible for there to be such a description as well. But the fact of identity doesn't depend on the existence of a mind per se, it depends on the existence of anything at all. And all the necessity of these facts demonstrate is the necessity of reality itself. There cannot be no reality at all. There are always facts, and since facts are about something, something necessarily has to exist. But it cannot in of itself demonstrate anything about the nature of what exists, nor what lies at the very foundation of reality, and it most certainly does not, and cannot, demonstrate that the foundation of reality is a mind of any sort. Now, I didn't initially think that I would have to include this in the video, but since so many apologists are eager to misunderstand, and since I know of people having this misconstrued notion, since I have an example, I will in fact include it. And this has to do with the notion of the laws of logic, and the laws of nature in this example, being transcended prescriptive rules by which the world must obey. But instead of taking my word for it, listen to one of your fellow apologists when Greg Koukl tries to make a similar argument to TAG, but regarding the laws of nature as metaphysical, transcendent, prescriptive governing rules when discussing Stephen Hawking.
Well, it seems to me that this raises a problem for him then, because as a materialist, what is the nature of these occult forces, these hidden powers that are lurking out somewhere? I don't know if they're in the material universe or not, but if they are laws that cause things to happen, what is the nature of those laws, and how does he square that with a materialistic account of the universe? And indeed, what gives these laws, what grounds the force of these laws to begin with? From where you sit, would that create a problem for him to say that these are prescriptive forces? I mean, from a materialistic perspective, does that strike you as being inconsistent and also something that requires a grounding outside of the materialistic universe?
Well, I don't think that we have to think of the laws of nature being prescriptive as being forces. It seems to me that what he could say would be that there are certain substances in the world that have certain essential properties, and that determines their behavior. And the laws of nature have the sort of necessity they do because of the properties.
I see. So he's going to ground it in their properties.
Have.
Okay. Well, that makes sense, at least as far as it goes.
Okay, so, Matt, this whole argument is predicated upon the idea that you can account for logical absolutes and I can't. So, the next thing that logically we should talk about is logic. Isn't that convenient? There's two things going on when it comes to logic, and a lot of people I notice make the mistake of treating them like they're the same thing, or at least confusing one thing with the other. Logic serves two different purposes. One is descriptive, and the other is prescriptive. Logic is descriptive of the universe, of existence. It's a representation of the way existence and all things that exist behave. It's a model of reality. It's descriptive, okay? Logic is also prescriptive for human beings. It instructs us on how to think and how to process in a way that matches reality. It prescribes principles to us so that we can govern our reasoning, so that we can arrive at more solid, better conclusions. The danger is when, whether we know it or not, we treat logic as if it's prescriptive for the universe, or reality, or existence, and it's not. The universe doesn't need a prescription for how to behave. It behaves the way it behaves. You take the law of non-contradiction, or the law of identity, and a lot of people think that it means that existence is being governed by laws, as if it were being told what to do. Not really. That's just an anthropomorphic expression we use. The behavior of existence isn't informed by logic. It informs logic, and logic in turn informs us. If anything, the law of non-contradiction is a law for us to help govern our thinking. Here's the thing about existence. Existence behaves consistently with itself. It just does. Things that exist reliably behave in a certain way, and they just don't behave another way. This is true of any philosophy, any worldview. You go back far enough, and there's going to be a set of basic preconditions to existence that just behave the way that they do. As human beings, we've observed this. We're able to make accurate predictions based on this, and we've created a language for ourselves of symbols and structures that act as a representation of what we observe about the universe. Now there's a couple of objections that I can imagine you making at this point. Both would demonstrate a profound misunderstanding of my position, but why not? Let me just check in here. Now, I could see you, for one, doing maybe a premature victory dance because you heard me acknowledge that logic is man-made, right? And you're getting ready to give me the whole spiel about how anything man-made is subjective because human minds think differently and so on and so forth. Now, the last thing I want to do is underestimate you, but if you are going down that road, if you are thinking that, then you miss the point and you're not paying attention. Logic is man-made in either worldview. We're talking about the language, the process that we've created. The consistency of existence, however, that logic was created to represent is not man-made. Existence behaves the way that it does independently of our consciousness or our perceptions, and it's thus not subjective. It is outside of ourselves. We can all observe it. We can all see the same thing. It's not just our opinion. Now, another thing you might be thinking on, riding the coattails of that is that observation isn't good enough, right? You might try and argue that since we are subjective beings, we can only observe the universe from one tiny little perspective and therefore aren't in a position of claiming that logical absolutes are in fact absolute. How would we know, right? Simply observing the universe and the consistency of existence doesn't justify us in putting stock in the law of non-contradiction, for example, because you'd need infinite knowledge in order to falsify it. And that's true. That's totally true. But if you think that's a legitimate objection to my worldview and not yours at the same time, then you're still missing the point. Because even if we assume the truth of Christianity, we're still in the same boat. Because remember, Matt, your worldview doesn't equip you to demonstrate that the law of non-contradiction, for example, is true. You can try and make the claim that logical absolutes can be accounted for by positing a God, but nothing about Christianity aids you in proving that the law of non-contradiction is one of those absolutes. Nothing in Scripture says that something can't be both A and not A at the same time. Nothing in the physical universe you believe God created verifies the law of non-contradiction. It's still a tautology, and it still has to assume its own truth in order to work. That's one of the liabilities of using logic. This is true of any and all logical principles, including the law of identity and the law of excluded middle, two other favorites of yours I've noticed. When it comes to identifying logical absolutes, you're in no better of a position than I am. And you, as well, have to rely on mere subjective observation. The best you can do is maintain that logical absolutes exist and that God is their source, but it wouldn't put you any closer to knowing with certainty what those absolutes are. When you say that theism accounts for logical absolutes, all you're saying is that if God existed, logical absolutes would be a reflection of his consciousness. But conveniently, Matt, you leave it at that, and you hope that I will too. However, it's pretty easy to call your bluff only by pointing out that God's consciousness, of which logical absolutes are a mere reflection, is itself unaccounted for by your worldview. You believe that the most default natural state of existence is that there is this emotionally and intellectually intricate consciousness you call God, and that this consciousness just is, and just is the way it is for no reason, with no cause. You can't account for why God exists instead of not existing. You can't account for why God has the traits and qualities he has instead of other traits and qualities. You can't account for why God's will is effective instead of ineffective or partially effective. Your beliefs about God render you unable to account for any aspect of God's consciousness or existence. So to say that logical absolutes aren't accounted for in my worldview, only to turn around to say that they are in yours because they are a reflection of something that is itself unaccounted for, well, that's just silly, don't you think? You drew a comparison more than once in your video between atheists accounting for logical absolutes and Christians accounting for God, and I was glad to see you do that because it demonstrates an understanding on your part that double standards won't fly here. Let me read to you something you said. You said, if the atheist says that logical absolutes just are, then he's still failing to give an account. Atheists object to Christians saying the same thing when they say that God just exists. So why should we accept a non-answer from an atheist who says that logic just is? You also said this. If the atheist doesn't need to give an account for logical absolutes, then he shouldn't complain if I were to say I don't need to give an account for God's existence. Well, Matt, for once I agree with you. But the thing is, I'm not the one complaining. That is to say, I'm not the one making the argument that things like God's existence or logical absolutes need to be accounted for in order for a worldview to be valid. You see, I wouldn't try to argue that theism isn't defensible unless you can fully account for God's existence and qualities, because I understand that no matter which worldview one subscribes to, there will always be, if you go back far enough, if you peel enough layers away, a set of basic preconditions to existence that have to be assumed that just are what they are. In mine, it's what you're calling logical absolutes, and in yours, it's God's existence and qualities and nature. But that's me. You have made your position very clear, and now I'm going to hold you accountable to your conclusions. You strongly maintain that for my worldview to be defensible, I would need to account for logical absolute. That means that you also strongly maintain that for your worldview to be defensible, you would need to account for God's existence and qualities and nature. Watch this, neat little trick. I'm just going to take those two statements of yours I read a second ago and interchange the key words. If the Christian says that God just is, then he's still failing to give an account. Further, if the Christian doesn't need to give an account for God's existence, then he shouldn't complain if I were to say I don't need to give an account for logical absolutes. Your reasoning, not mine. So, let's hear it. Matt, how do you account for God's existence? I'm going to close out, and I'm going to close out by paraphrasing a quote from somebody that I know you hold in very high regard. He said, "Do not concern yourself with a speck of sawdust in your neighbor's eye when you have yet to remove the log from your own."
You began your video with this familiar mantra. The tag argument states that when there are only two possibilities to account for something and one of them is negated, by default the other one is vindicated. Yeah, unless of course the something in question does not actually exist or occur, and until you're able to A, present a clear and specific definition for logical absolutes, not just listing what you believe to be examples of them, and B, sufficiently demonstrate that such things actually exist in reality, your argument can't even get off the ground. The fact is, Matt, the phrase logical absolute does not exist anywhere in academia. That's not a real thing. This is not a term recognized by legitimate mathematicians or logicians. This is not a term you'll find in any encyclopedia of philosophy. You and other apologists have essentially made it up, all on your own, for the purpose of arguments like this. This has been repeatedly pointed out to you on your own message boards and elsewhere by atheists and Christians alike, and you've conveniently ignored it. What we do have are axiomatic statements, like A is A, or A is not A, which we base logical procedures on. And we call these statements laws of logic. We call them laws because if one is going to make logical inferences properly, one must play by these rules. We base these rules on simple observations we can make about the nature of existence, language, and definition. So we have two different things here, which in your argument, you're fallaciously conflating into one. We have the mere statement, A is A, which is conceptual by nature and which does not exist independently of consciousness, and that's true in either of our worldviews. And then we have that to which the statement A is A refers. Now what the statement A is A refers to is not a thing with its own existence. Rather, what A is A refers to is the behavior of things that exist, the nature of things that exist, including your God, if there were one. In your video, you said the following. TBS says that the universe behaves the way it behaves. Well, that's obvious, but stating the obvious does not refute tag. Well, yes, Matt. As a matter of fact, stating the obvious is all it takes to refute tag. We have the consistent nature of existence, observable by anyone. We have laws of logic, which are axiomatic statements we use to describe the nature of existence. We have logical procedures, which we base on these axiomatic statements, and we have the capability to create and adhere to consistent definitions. Nothing more than these things is necessary for logical processes to occur, and nothing about these things requires the existence of an invisible, transcendent, absolute, disembodied mind. Now, if your concern is that logical laws cannot be the product of human minds because human minds perceive and think differently from one another, well, you'll be happy to know that nobody ever claimed these laws were the collective product of all human minds acting unanimously. That's an absurd mischaracterization, convenient only for you. Only a handful of thoughtful people throughout history have contributed to the establishment of these axioms. It's not up for a vote. Other human beings are either on the same page or they aren't. A human being is free to arrive at any conclusion they wish, but if they intend for their inferences to be considered logically valid, their reasoning has to be consistent with these axioms. If it isn't, we have a word for that. It's called illogical. Happens all the time. Here's what it comes down to. TAG asserts that logical absolutes, a word you made up, are things whose existence need to be accounted for. But you have yet to clearly define these things or demonstrate that these things exist as you have defined them. And until you do, it is fallacious for you to assert that they need to be accounted for. You wouldn't claim that one of our worldviews must account for the tooth fairy, would you? No, because the tooth fairy is not known to exist as defined. And neither are logical absolutes until you can demonstrate otherwise. We're all still waiting. The closest you've ever come to defining logical absolutes is to say that they are truths. But truth is not a thing that exists in and of itself. Truth is a word we use to describe a certain type of relationship between a statement and reality, namely that the statement reflects reality accurately. So to say that logical absolutes are truths is to do nothing more than identify them as the accurateness or the accuracy of statements like A is A. But if logical absolutes are defined as the accuracy of statements like A is A, rather than being defined as the statements themselves or that to which the statements refer, then you would be incorrect in saying that A is an example of a logical absolute. It wouldn't be in this case. So to define logical absolutes as truths is to define them inconsistently with the way you've been using the term. So again, I ask you, what are they? The bottom line is this. You have made something up, which you call logical absolutes. You have neglected to define it. You have failed to demonstrate that it exists as defined. You have used words to describe it which conflict with the examples you actually give for it, and then you demand that I give an account for the supposed existence of your made-up thing when you have not even successfully done so yourself. And you think this junkyard of confused rhetoric proves the existence of the Christian God. Matt, I'm so sorry, but you're going to have to be more forgiving of those of us who can't seem to take this argument seriously.
So, here's a question I've heard floating around lately. Can atheism account for the laws of logic? Well, the answer is yes. But atheism is not special in this regard. Absolutely anyone can account for the laws of logic. You simply have to realize that logic is a made-up human concept. It's not an objective property of the universe. Now, in the universe, things do happen, events take place that can be expressed with the human concept of logic, but there are no laws of logic out there written on stone tablets or something. The events themselves are objective, but the laws of logic we use to express them are not. Another good example would be math. Math does not actually exist. It's an expressive tool. It's something we humans made up. Events happen in the universe that can be expressed mathematically, but there aren't numbers and equations floating around in space working themselves out. That would be objective. Whenever a theist tries to muddy the water with a question like this, here's a good thing to keep in mind, a little something to fall back on if you ever get confused. The natural state of the universe consists only of time, space, matter, energy, and forces all interacting with each other. Those interactions are known as events, and that's all they are. Everything that we see, everything that is objectively real, falls into these categories. And that's it. There is no more. Anything else, anything outside of that is simply an abstract concept that we make up. It comes and goes with us, and it does not exist apart from us. That's the real truth of the universe. That's the big picture. And if you keep it in mind, you'll never be thrown off by these convoluted theist arguments. Because you'll know that we only run into these abstract concepts, such as logic and morality, when we delve into the human brain. But without us, those things wouldn't exist even as thoughts. So it's easy to account for these things because they all originate from right in here.